Ambassador John Herbst, for more than 3 decades, has been at the forefront of American diplomacy, security, and international affairs. A career diplomat who rose to the rank of career minister, one of the highest distinctions in the United States Foreign Service. Ambassador Herbst served as U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan during a period of growing strategic importance for Central Asia, and later as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine during the Orange Revolution, a defining moment in the country's democratic development. His service extended beyond diplomacy. At the U.S. Department of State, he served as coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization, leading U.S. civilian efforts to assist countries emerging from conflict and instability. He also served as director of the Center for Complex Operations at the National Defense University, helping strengthen cooperation among diplomatic, civilian, and military institutions in addressing international crises. A recipient of some of the highest honors in American public service, Ambassador Herbst is today widely recognized as one of America's leading experts on Ukraine, Russia, Eurasian security, and the challenges posed by disinformation, influence operations, and hybrid warfare. Today, he serves as Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center.
So, Ambassador Herbst, we're so happy to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
The first question I would like to raise is talk about your past. So you start your career as a diplomat in diplomacy since 1979.
Correct.
So why did you choose diplomat way? And when is particularly you understood that you want to go deeper in the question of disinformation and the information influence and learn it more like how it works systematically and so on?
All right. Like many boys of my generation, I was interested in war. And I remember being 7 or 8 and reading everything I could about the American Revolution, the American Civil War, and later about World War I and World War II. And by the time I was in junior high school, so maybe 13 or so, I remember reading about negotiations to end the dispute in Cyprus. I thought, this is interesting. And a couple of years later in high school, I began to learn that there's such a life of a diplomat. I read several books by George Kennan, and I said, maybe this is something I want to do. And I studied international relations in college, which was unusual then in the early 1970s because there were very few international relations programs. Georgetown University had a school devoted to diplomacy, and that's where I studied. And from there, I became a Foreign Service officer.
I'm going to have, in the end of our podcast interview, I'm going to have the one question about George Kennan.
Okay.
We're going to go to that. But yeah, so now if we move to the topic basically of the disinformation, specifically Russian disinformation. So in your writings, you've argued actually that the purpose of disinformation is often not simply to persuade people of particular narrative, but to undermine confidence on basically of existence of the objective truth.
Right.
So why has this strategy proven to be so effective in the 21st century?
Well, it's one important reason is that certainly Western culture, American and European, is deeply skeptical. And if the culture, elite culture, prizes skepticism, then it's relatively easy to sow doubt because you're speaking to an audience which is susceptible to such arguments. And I think that's why we've seen, going back to the very first days of Moscow's war on Ukraine, so I'm talking about 2014, when you had the Russian shoot-down of the Malaysian airliner in the summer of 14, Russian disinformation was putting out all kinds of different narratives in order to divert attention from the true narrative, which this was a relatively sophisticated Russian missile, the Buk, which was used to shoot down that airliner.
If we talk about the term itself, the propaganda term, right? So it became especially prominent in the 20th century, including the during the World War II. So in your view, what makes modern Russian propaganda distinct from earlier form of propaganda, and why is it particularly dangerous today?
There are a lot of similarities between Soviet propaganda and propaganda we see today. It's information or bad information that is put together to meet the foreign policy goals of an aggressive power. Now, the circumstances from, say, the 1930s and 1940s to today are quite different. At that point, you had a substantial portion of the Western elite that was inclined towards communist or at least socialist ideals. So you would put out information designed to motivate them to oppose the policies of Western governments, which Moscow did not like. Today, as we've already just discussed, you have a different worldview where skepticism is very important. And so they have different techniques designed, again, with the same purpose of influencing elites to make it easier for Moscow to achieve its foreign policy gains, even those gains hurt American security or contradict Western values.
You already basically, I think, answered the next question, but maybe you will have something to add, because it's very interesting. What is the real objective of the Russian disinformation? We understand it's the influence, like you said, on the foreign policies and achieving their goals. But overall, is it mainly to convince actually audience of Russian position, or is it more about deepening polarization, weakening the trust?
Again, if you go back to the last century, certainly up until at least 1956, when you had this Khrushchev's secret speech about all the crimes of Stalin, but even after that, you had a substantial portion of the Western elite who were inclined to see Moscow as not, or communism as not a particularly evil and dangerous phenomenon. So you could build on that support to mobilize them, again, against Western governments' efforts to combat communism. You don't have a similar audience ready for this, for such Kremlin narratives today. And so they work in a climate of doubt. And then the idea is to make sure that the nasty truth is not recognized. Because if the nasty truth of what the Kremlin is up to was well understood, policy designed to thwart Kremlin objectives, to prevent Moscow from achieving its goals, would become much stronger. Mm-hmm. So times have changed, the tactics have changed, but the use of state resources, pushing of specific bits of real and false information, has always been there.
You yourself basically made a significant contribution to countering Russian disinformation and propaganda and its influence to the United States and to Europe. And here I want to raise the question about the United States, and that basically since 2016, the United States has taken some steps to expose and disrupt Russian influence operations, including actions against the accounts linked to Russian trolls, bot farms, networks, and so on. Yet, political and societal social divisions we see in polarization is growing right now, continues to grow within the United States, if we're talking in Europe as well. How vulnerable are the United States and Europe to Russian disinformation today? And what concrete measures should democratic societies take to basically be more resilient to it nowadays?
I don't want to overstate the impact of Russian information campaigns. It's real, it is dangerous, and one of its objectives is to promote strife in the societies of its adversaries, including the United States. But there are always going to be more important domestic reasons in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, wherever, which produce tensions in those countries. And so I hesitate to blame this all on the Kremlin. I think that's a mistake. But they do play a role. And they can spot, they devote a great deal of money and a great deal of human attention to this. So they can spot tensions and they can insert their narratives in these societies to exploit them. And the best defense against this is to pay careful attention to Russian narratives, and frankly, they don't hide their narratives. What they try to inject into American society or German society is right there in Russian state media, or on Russian social media, or in the statements coming from people who play a role in Russian policy. I mean, Surkov back in the day before he was banished from the Kremlin, Peskov to this day, and others. And so you begin to see what's going on. And then you have to have people in the West who become expert at this to call them out. And it also helps to have governments in the West that are understanding of the problem so that they also can provide their contribution to undercutting Kremlin narratives. But here you have a problem that to talk about this frankly for a government, then you're alerting your own population to a problem which is emanating from a foreign power. And if you are a politician who may be very smart but doesn't have much of a backbone, maybe you don't want that information out in the public space. I mean, one of the problems in dealing with the Kremlin aggression in Ukraine is our leaders have been unwilling to state plainly to the American public how A, immoral, but also B, dangerous Russian activity is. Because then the natural question is, so what are you doing about it, sir? And if you're skittish about a confrontation with an aggressive nuclear power, then you don't want that. And you know, the Biden administration's policy towards the Russian aggression in Ukraine was only adequate because they were afraid to call out the Kremlin in a very clear way, which would have required a stronger response. President Trump has had his own peculiar approach to Vladimir Putin, which also gets in the way of clarity. I mean, sometimes he talks about Russia as an adversary, for example, when he's talking about Greenland or Cuba. But when he's talking about the place where Russia's activity is most dangerous, like Ukraine or Europe, we don't hear Russia as an adversary. So that also does not contribute to a clear understanding of the danger, and of which information operations are only one part.
Now we already moved to Ukraine's topic, and here I would like to discuss the interesting fact that you brought up. And this is basically one of the lessons that Russia's war against Ukraine was prepared not only in the battlefield, but in the information space as well. And that for years, Moscow presented the war in Donbass as a civil conflict rather than the Kremlin-directed operation. So here, the question is, how seriously does American society currently take the threat of foreign influence through the information warfare, and how significant you see the threat might be for the national security of the U.S.?
It was truly amazing and frustrating. Almost in the entire period before the Russian big invasion of Ukraine, watching Western media, especially in 2014, 15, 16, talk about strife between pro-Russian groups in Ukraine and the government in Kyiv. As I pointed out then, and I point out today, the uprising in Donbass was planned, financed, armed, and even staffed from Russia. But one important reason why this was the point of reference for respected media in the United States and in Europe is because their governments refused to state it plainly. But you know, the first president of the Donbass People's Republic was Mr. Borodai, you know, a polittechnologue from Moscow. And the first defense minister was, you know, Colonel Girkin Strelkov, right, an FSB adventurer. So that gave the game away for anyone who had eyes to see. But I believe that the weak reporting coming from, again, prestige media was because of weak-kneed politicians.
And as a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, right, what do you believe basically Ukraine's experience taught the entire world? What lessons from Ukraine's experience with Russian influence operations should the U.S. and Europe take very much seriously today?
I don't know if the lessons from Ukraine are readily transferable. I say that because Russia was in the Ukrainian media space in a very effective way, not certainly up till they seized Crimea, but even in the period of the less oppressive Russian war. I mean, before the big invasion. I mean, when I became ambassador in Kiev in 2003, I would say, Russian TV was more influential in Ukraine than Ukrainian TV. And Putin was easily the most popular politician in Ukraine. And even after the Orange Revolution, Putin remained the most popular politician in the east and south of Ukraine. He was never popular in the west, but he was the most popular politician in the center of the country, meaning in Kiev and along the whole Dnipro, whether it's from Odessa in the south, well, Odessa's the south, but whether you're talking about, Zaporizhia or you're talking about Dnipro and going up to Sumy, Putin was popular, not as popular as in the east and the south. But after the Orange Revolution, he was not so popular because people understood he was trying to manipulate the election of 2004. And again, Russian TV had substantial sway in the east and the south up until the big invasion, and that destroyed it.
I remember I was reading what you back then suggested regarding the Russian media. I mean, within the Ukraine, and how much is it important so that the media in Ukraine will be independent and there will be no Russian media influence in Ukraine. Yeah. How has Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine changed basically the way the US and Europe think about deterrence, alliances, and long-term security?
It was clear up until the big invasion that major Western powers were very weak on Russian aggression in Ukraine. And it's absolutely amazing that to this day, Angela Merkel has no regrets about her leadership on this issue. It does not speak well of the Chancellor. But, I mean, famously, Germany did a 180-degree turn, although it really wasn't a 180-degree turn after the big invasion. The Zeitenwende, Scholz's Zeitenwende was not a real Zeitenwende, but it was a step in the right direction. And Merz now is pursuing a truly sensible policy. For the first time we have real leadership in Germany. The Brits were always sound. The French were not. Macron was always trying to get to Moscow and negotiate before the big invasion. And he turned around solidly right after that. And we've seen that in much of Western Europe. But it took the big invasion, which is far long. They should have understood this once Crimea was seized. And the United States was better than most of Europe in that period, but still not wonderful. And I already talked about, Biden's unwillingness to state clearly and consistently the danger that Kremlin aggression posed to the United States. He would occasionally raise it, but only occasionally. And the policy never reflected the extent of the danger. And Trump, again, had just been sui generis.
And if we also, coming back to the information warfare, and the disinformation, today, basic information space saturated with the disinformation, right? And many people honestly no longer know what is truth, what is false. And instead of reading some very serious analysis, and we talk about the general population, instead of reading the serious analysis, they turn to social media, where Russia basically knows very well how to operate, right? And that's operate basically very effectively there. So here I would like to ask about the concept of narrative laundering. So how do Russian narratives move from social media and fringe spaces into more respectable media outlets or policy even discussions nowadays? And what can serious journalists and institutions do to avoid unintentionally repeating or even legitimizing the disinformation today?
Well, here too, this is a new circumstance. I mean, social media did not exist 50 years ago, but the basic mode of operation today is quite similar to the mode of operation when there was a Soviet Union. Then, as well, the Kremlin was trying to get their points of view into prestige media in the West, and they would start by running stories in small media, whether it was in India or someplace in Africa. I mean, this is how they began to spread the notion that the United States created AIDS and spread it globally. It began with articles in small media in the third world in the 80s. And so now you have social media, and social media is a feeder into mainstream media. And so you're now using that. And again, the Kremlin developed expertise with this type of media movement, information movement through media 100 years ago. And so now they're applying it today in new circumstances. But again, if you have smart people in the private sector, I mean academia, in NGOs who are understanding of these issues and they are paying attention, that's one way to fight it. But it all starts with having clarity from governments, which also encourages major media to see things plainly. But we haven't had the best leadership on national security issues since Bush the Elder, in my opinion, we in the United States.
And how do you see, like when you mentioned that, let us say the NGOs or the academia, they can counter it, right? And basically work on that if they understand the issue. So what exactly, what's the way to counter it? So
look, there are a lot of smart people now in the West, the United States, and in Europe, talking about Russian information operations. So the knowledge is out there. The problem is, this is true of anything, anyone trying to learn about issues today is overwhelmed with information. So it's not so easy, even for smart people trying to look into an issue, to figure out where's the right information to go. But again, you have different centers in universities and elsewhere writing about this. And so there's a fair amount of information out there. And I think that in the United States, we're not in bad shape regarding Russian disinformation. Although it is true, there are pockets in the Republican Party that have bought Russian narratives. There are pockets, not as large, in the Democratic Party, which have bought Russian narratives. And there are a fair number of Americans who are not necessarily affiliated with either party who have come across Russian narratives. And it's unfortunate that, at least for a period of time, going back to the late teens, issues relating to Ukraine became part of a partisan split between Republicans and Democrats. The whole, the perfect in quotation marks, Trump-Zelensky phone call, right, in 2019, and then the impeachment that followed was a problem.
I think we're moving actually to our last question, and as I said in the beginning, so here I want to raise such a question about the long telegram that George Kennan's warned about, and he said that Moscow would look really for weak points in the Western societies, exploit divisions, fatigue, distrust, and social conflicts. And in that sense, the answer was not only to react to Moscow, but also to make American society stronger and more resilient. So, your opinion, do you think this logic still applies today? And basically, can foreign influence campaigns deepen divisions that already exist, even if they are not creating it? And can basically information warfare weaken a country without a single shot being fired?
Well, of course, disinformation, a pointed media campaign can weaken a country without any reference to weapons. Kennan's general insight is still true. that you have a hostile power, which has only the worst instincts for the future of the United States, conducting information operations here. And it's important that we understand that and take appropriate measures. Again, that starts with sound government policy. And Kennan is one of the reasons why we had sound government policy in the late 1940s and afterwards. I don't think our policy today in respect to this danger is nearly as good as it was 75 plus years ago, or 60 years ago for that matter. But it's certainly better than it was in 2014, 2015.
Yeah, thank you so much for
My
your
pleasure.
time. That was a pleasure to talk to you.
I enjoyed
Thank
the conversation
you for answering
too.
all the questions, and wish you all the best. And
You too.
Yeah,
Thank you.